Welcome back, everyone. In this series of lectures, we're going to be talking about the different ways you can combine multiple data frames. And we'll start off with concatenation. So often the data you need exists in two or more separate sources. And fortunately for us, Pandas makes it really easy to combine these various sources together. You can have multiple CSV files or maybe some data in a SQL database and some data in an Excel spreadsheet, and you want to read them both in with Pandas and then combine them. So there's many different ways you can combine separate data frames. And the simplest combination is if both sources are already in the same format. Then what we can do is perform a concatenation through the pd.concat call. And that's all that's needed. So let me show you the kinds of examples you can perform with concatenation. So concatenation, the way I like to think about it is simply just pasting or gluing together the two data frames. And you can do this by columns. So here you can see we have two separate data frames. We can see United States, Canada, and Mexico, and we only have the year and population in one data frame. And then in the other data frame on the right, we have the same exact rows, but we have GDP and some percentage instead. So what we want to do is we essentially want to glue these together in order to get all the information for the four columns together. And keep in mind, this does have the requirement that each row lines up with the other row in the other data frame, which may not always be the case, in which case we'll actually talk about merging and joining in later lectures when we're talking about combining data frames. But for right now, we're operating under the assumption that they're already in the same format, which allows us to simply glue them together or paste them together through the concatenation on the columns. Keep in mind, we can also perform concatenation on rows. So here we can see the concatenation happening where we have the exact same columns in both data frames, but in this case we have different instances on the rows. One data frame has USA and Canada, and the other data frame has Mexico and Brazil. And we can simply then concatenate or glue together by the rows to get the full data frame. What's nice about Pandas is it's also going to automatically fill in null values where necessary. So let's explore some examples with Pandas on concatenating along rows and along columns. And then in subsequent lectures, we'll talk about combining data frames through the merge command. Let's head to a fresh Jupyter notebook. Okay, here I am at a Jupyter notebook. As you can see, I've already filled in some code, and this is just copied and pasted from the lecture notebook called Combining Data Frames. So if you open up the Combining Data Frames notebook, which is going to be relevant to this series of lectures, we can see here we have the import commands as well as this data1 and data2 dictionaries and these Pandas data frames calls. You'll also notice that there's an official guide link here with lots of examples. I highly recommend that you check that out because it's super useful. Just to show you what that link looks like, it's this link here called merge, join, concatenate, and compare. And if you just Google search pandas, merge, join, concatenate, usually this link shows up very highly on the Google search results. But what's nice about this is it essentially is a really long document, really explaining pretty much every type of merge or joining or combination of data frames. And it has the images as well as the example data frames. So you can visually see what each result actually looks like. Okay, so keep that in mind. This is a fantastic resource. Has a nice little documentation links here that you can check out, such as concatenating using append or ignoring indices, data frame style, etc. So we're going to come back here and we're going to start off with just the simplest way to combine data frames, which is assuming that they're more or less in the same format and that you can just glue or paste them together. So let's check out these data frames. I've called them 1 and 2. So data frame 1, it has the columns A and B, and then indices are 0, 1, 2, 3. And you'll notice that in order to keep track of what column and what index was a cell value associated with, the actual cell values are the column name followed by the original index. So we have A0, A1, B1, B2, and so on. And then here for data frame 2, it's the same index calls, 0, 1, 2, 3. And then we can see we have different column names, however, C and D. So let's think about the different ways we can concatenate this. So one way we can attempt to concatenate is by doing it along the columns, essentially saying, I have the same index positions, 0, 1, 2, 3, for both data frames. And all I want to do is have a single data frame with 4 columns, column A, column B, column C, and column D. The way we do that is we say pd.concat And then what you're going to do is you're going to pass in as a list the data frame objects. So I often forget to actually put in the list brackets, so don't forget that. You put in the list brackets and then say my first data frame and then my second data frame. And then if you want to join them along the columns, you specify axis is equal to 1. So we run this, and here we can see probably the way that makes the most sense to actually join these data frames. And the index then stays the same for both because it matched up on both 0, 0, 1, 1, and so on. So that is the way to concatenate along the columns. You specify here 1, 2, and then axis equal to 1. Keep in mind, if we specified 2, 1, it'd give you the same result except the column order would be switched, C, D, A, and B. Now let's talk about concatenating along the rows. And there's something to keep in mind here. When I take a look at these two data frames, originally, I have AB and then CD, which means if I said PD concat, and then I said 1, 2, and I said axis equal to 0, meaning concatenate along the rows, by default, what Pandas is going to do is it's actually going to fill in essentially half of the points with null values, as you can see here by running the code. So why is this happening? The main reason is to signify the difference between the C and D columns versus the A and B columns, because you can't have two values sitting at the same position for index 0. So instead of having to choose between A and C for index 0, what it's done is essentially now duplicated the index 0, 1, 2, 3, and then repeats again 0, 1, 2, 3. So for the original 0 on the A and B on that one data frame, C and D didn't have any values for that particular 0. Instead, they have it for what is essentially their own 0 index. This is also basically a good intuition or notifying you that it was probably not a good idea to join these two by axis is equal to 0, since it doesn't really make sense since they're sharing the same index calls. As we can see here, probably the way that makes the most sense is to join them by the columns. But let's imagine the situation where you actually do want to join them by rows, but you want to go ahead and just have C and D relabeled A and B, because maybe in a different data set they had different column names. But really what you want is you want A0, A1, A2, A3, and then you want to continue along the same column with C0, C1, C2, and then for B you want B0 to B3, and then D0 through D3. You essentially don't want these null values over here, but instead you want these guys shifted over to these two original columns. So how do we do that? Well, the easiest way to do this is to simply rename the columns of 2. So all you need to do in that case is have the column names actually match up. So you can imagine we read in this one data frame with columns A, B, and then I read in a second data frame with columns C, D. And for some reason, this second data frame, I actually know based off my domain experience or someone I talked to, one of my colleagues, that C and D are actually the same values for A and B. It's the same feature. And what I want to do is join these so that I have 8 rows. Well, the way to do that is simply say that the columns for 2 should be the same as the columns for 1. And so then when I look at 2, you'll notice I've renamed the columns A and B while retaining the original values C0, D0, and so on. And that means now, since the column names match up, Pandas is not going to have any issue concatenating these by the row. So we say PD concat, pass in as a list the 2 data frames, specify axis is equal to 0, run that, and now it went ahead and merged them in maybe the way you wanted here. Okay. Keep in mind, it's still keeping this duplicated index call, which means you'd have to start actually assigning this to something like mydf is equal to pd concat. Here you have mydf, and then you can always grab the index and then set it equal to something like range of length of mydf. And that's what you could do if you wanted to then reset the index. It's kind of up to you and depends on the situation. But just keep in mind that PD concat is going to consider these column names in order to join or concatenate these correctly. Okay, so that's it for concatenation. Again, it's the simplest one, And there's two different ways to do it. You either do it along the columns as this, or you do it along the rows. If you do it along the rows and the column names don't match up, it'll give you null values. In order to fix this, for certain situations, you can just reassign the columns and then join it that way to get back a result that looks like this. All right, coming up next, we're going to expand our knowledge and learn about merge. I'll see you there.